Hey, I'm Ken Russell, and this is my 1965 Volvo 1800S called the Sinner. So it was in pretty rough condition when I got it. After redoing all of the suspension, the engine was in pretty good shape, but I upgraded it with Mikuni carburetor, double carbs, and as well as a new aluminum radiator. I moved the choke from over here so it's tucked into the fender, and then I tucked all of the wire loom, all the fuses and relays that were over here into the fender well as well, and added a battery kill switch. It runs really well. I've had very little problems. It hasn't overheated. It's a great car. It's got a 4-speed with a 5th gear overdrive in it. It's really a joy to drive. So I've been a Volvo guy since 1997, when Val Kilmer was the Saint in the movie called The Saint. He drove a Volvo C70, and I think that was their first sports coupe since this car back in the 60s. And I just fell in love with it. I wanted to be Val Kilmer, and I had to have that car, and that started my love affair with the Volvo brand. Since then, I've owned that C70. I had an S90, an XC70, a V60 cross country, and everyone in my family's had Volvos as well, but I've always wanted the P1800. Well, Volvos are known for, safety and sensibility, but certainly not style. And this car may be one of the major exceptions for them. They're a Swedish company, and this particular model was designed, however, in Italy by the Frua house, which also designed Carmen Ghia. So you can see those sort of romantic Italian lines in the car. It's got the fins and the sweeping hood and the sweeping chrome, a lot of curves. It's a beautiful design, but the Swedes still claim it because the son of one of the designers, Pell Peterson, was working for House Frua, and he was actually one of the head designers on the car, so it still does have Swedish genetics to it. I didn't know it at the time when Val Kilmer was the Saint, but that movie was a remake of the 1960s TV show in the UK called The Saint, with Roger Moore, who played Simon Templar, who was the Saint, and that was before he was James Bond. I was an 80s kid with Roger Moore's James Bond. What I didn't know till later was that he was the Saint, and he drove this car in that TV show. It was one of the very first spy TV shows where a car was kind of one of the stars of the show. And that's what made this car famous. Originally, the producers of the show had wanted a Jaguar E-Type in the show as the spy car, but Jaguar wasn't interested and didn't provide the car, so Roger Moore provided his own personal car, which was the P1800, and that one was in white, and that's why they called it the Saint. It was kind of angelic, and his logo had a halo. I've taken it a different direction. I've made a much darker version of the car, and so mine has horns and a tail, and he's called the Sinner. So one of the first times and reasons I decided to call it was the Sinner was realizing how blasphemous this was to Volvo Club of America's rules for judging a P1800. I got kicked out of my first car show after I finished the restoration. I was so proud of it, but once I showed up, I was just rolling in and they disqualified me on the spot because of all the modifications. And you don't see a lot of resto mods of the Volvo 1800, but for me, there were a few things I just felt that would improve its aesthetic. And first was the stance. The original Volvo P1800 had a very narrow, tall stance, very top-heavy with a lot of roll. the wheels were only 5 inches wide and they were set inboard quite a bit. So I chose to lower the car with racing springs and Bilstein shocks, and then I also widened it a lot by moving it to 8-inch wide wheels, much fatter tires, and then adding the fender flares once the wheels had breached sort of the outer limits of the car, which really changed the handling. It rides so much better now. It's much stiffer, much less roll, and I think it really improves the look. So that was the main aesthetic change. The next thing I did was remove the bumpers. It has large chrome bumpers traditionally, and I felt that the curves of the body were just so pretty without that. I just have to drive a little more carefully. And once I did that, the license plate, which once hung on the back bumper, had to be replaced, and so I flushed it in with the back of the car in what they call Frenching. I inset the license plate to the flush line of the back of the car. It was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to own one someday, but the thing that pushed me toward buying it was watching the prices start to go up little by little over the years. And I thought, at some point I'm not going to be able to afford this car, and so I started shopping for it, and I found one online in pretty rough condition in California. So I bought it sight unseen and shipped it over to Florida and started to work.
Volvo 1800S, 1965.
So the original interior of this car was black and it was really beat up. Everything needed replacing, so I decided to go with red leather, which was an upgrade from the factory vinyl. But I found a guy up in the Northeast who specifically did leather for the P1800, and it was a good choice. The dashboard was a little trickier. Almost none of the dashboard worked, none of the instruments worked. I took them all apart one at a time. Some of them needed chrome work, some of them needed instrumentation. The temperature gauge didn't work, the fuel gauge didn't work, the tach didn't work. But I really wanted it all to come together and have everything function on the dash in a beautiful way. So instead of the large foam, the cracked foam that was on top of the dash, I decided to strip it back to metal, go back to some of my surfing roots. I shaped it like a surfboard with fiberglass over the metal. Has more of a 50s vibe to it, because then I painted it, gloss and clear coat in red to match the interior. Well, it's not as recognizable or as collected as a lot of the other cars of the era. It was competing with the Mercedes 300 SL and the E-Type and the Aston Martin, but it was competing in a very aggressive way. One of their first ads was, what does it feel like to drive a $10,000 sports car? And it showed all of those competitors in the ad, and then at the bottom it said, find out for $39.95. And that was the price of the P1800. So it was really an everyday man's sports car. And it was really more of a grand touring car. The engine itself isn't as strong as those cars, but man, it is durable. The P1800 holds the Guinness World Record for miles driven from one owner, which is over 3.5 million miles. So I haven't taken it on any really long road trips, even though this car is famously good for that. I take it out every weekend. I go out and have pancakes with the kids and go out to my favorite dive bar at night. And of course, everybody loves it when it's out. A lot of people have nostalgic memories of the P1800, and so they love to come over and talk about that. More often than not, people don't know what it is, and they're very surprised to see that it's a Volvo. The folks who do know the car are very passionate about it, but most people who drive Volvos are soccer moms these days and executives, and they're really happy to see that their car that they own has roots like this, because this is back when the Volvo had a totally different spirit and feel. One thing I wanted to do with the engine bay was really clean it up. I enjoy the velocity stacks on the Mikuni twin carbs. I think that gives it a great look and a beautiful sound. But I also wanted to get rid of as much of the wiring as I could, so I did a real tuck on the whole wiring loom, which normally runs along the left-hand side of the inside fender well. So I rewired the whole car and tucked that under the fender and eliminated as much of the wiring and tubing that crossed over the valve cover as possible. I really wanted to show off the red block of the B18 engine, which is what the car is really famous for. And so I hope I accomplished that in kind of keeping it really simple and pretty, just making it a bit of a jewel box for the engine itself. some of the other upgrades, I went with, instead of the Lucas headlights it would have traditionally had, I went with the French Marshall racing headlights, which are now made for motorcycles in Japan. But the Marshall headlights with the little cat logo on front, I thought was quite fitting. I really wanted to make this car mine, even though I fell in love with the original 1800 that I would have seen in the magazines and on TV. I wanted this to be special and in my own way. And I think resto modding cars is becoming quite popular, but there's a really high-end, out-of-reach aspect to that, which isn't attractive to the average car driver or buyer. I don't have a history in restoring cars. This is my first time, and I did it all myself. And it just goes to show you that anybody can do it, and you can make your car yours, and you don't have to feel bad about changing the original. This car was in pretty rough shape when I got it, so I didn't feel too bad about making the real changes to it.